The stagecoach did not stop in Ellison Flats so much as it surrendered. It lurched sideways, groaned against its own brake, and spat a single passenger into the yellow dust of a town that smelled like cattle and regret. The woman who stepped down wore a dress the color of storm clouds and held one carpetbag in both hands as though it were a child she might drop. Her name was Eleanor Fry, and she had come 1,200 miles to marry a man she had never seen, to mother 7 boys she had never met, and to fill a house whose silence she could already feel from here, pressing outward through the walls like something trapped. She did not know yet that the boys had drawn lots to decide who would hide her shoes, who would salt the flour, and who would release the rooster into her bedroom at 3 in the morning. She did not know that the men in the saloon across the street had a wager running. 4-1 she would be on the next coach east, and the only question was whether she would last until sunrise or break before supper. She did not know that the man she had come to marry had not spoken a full sentence to another adult in 14 months, and that his neighbors had stopped trying. She knew only this. Somewhere behind her was a house in Philadelphia with 4 rooms and no sound in any of them, and she would rather walk barefoot into a canyon full of rattlesnakes than go back to it. If this story already has its fingers around your heart, do me a kindness. Subscribe right now and ring that bell so you never miss one of these. And tell me in the comments, what town are you listening from tonight? I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the dust and the heat, because what happened next is the part no one in Ellison Flats ever expected. The man waiting at the livery was not what she had pictured. Silas Greer was tall, but the kind of tall that looked like it had been earned through suffering rather than luck. Shoulders rounded forward as though bracing against a wind that never stopped. His hat was pulled low. His jaw was set in a line that suggested it had forgotten any other shape. He looked at Eleanor the way a man looks at a bill he knows he cannot pay. "Mrs. Fry," he said, not a question, a fact he was accepting. "Mr. Greer." He took her carpetbag without asking and turned toward a wagon that had seen better decades. 2 boys sat in the back of it, watching her the way coyotes watch a lantern, curious, suspicious, ready to bolt or bite depending on what happened next. The older one, maybe 13, had his mother's jaw, though Eleanor did not know that yet. The younger, perhaps 9, clutched something in his fist, a small tin object she could not quite see. "These are the oldest and the youngest," Silas said. "The rest are at the house." 7, Eleanor said, confirming. 7. He said the number the way another man might say a prison sentence. The ride to the ranch took 40 minutes over land so dry it looked like God had started making it and walked away. Eleanor tried twice to speak. Both times, Silas answered with a nod so slight it might have been the road. The older boy, whose name was Thatcher, stared at her shoes as though memorizing them for later sabotage, which, as it turned out, was exactly what he was doing. The house appeared over a low ridge like something that had crawled there to die and then changed its mind. It was large, larger than she expected, with a porch that sagged on the left side and a chimney that leaned like a man in his cups. But it was real, and it was solid, and when the wind shifted, Eleanor caught the smell of sage and pine pitch, and underneath it something older, the ghost of bread baking, or the memory of it. 5 more boys spilled off the porch as the wagon pulled up. They ranged in age from roughly 5 to 11, and every single one of them looked at Eleanor with the same expression. "A dare. You won't last," the oldest said. Thatcher, 13 years old and already foreman of a rebellion. "I have lasted through worse than you," Eleanor said, and she meant it in ways none of them could understand, not yet, and she hoped they never would. The terms had been set by letter. She would keep the house, cook the meals, mend the clothes, and tend to the boys' schooling. In exchange, she would have a room of her own, the small one at the end of the hall, with its own door and its own lock, and the legal protection of Silas Greer's name. It was a transaction, a business arrangement pressed into the shape of a marriage. "There's a preacher in town," Silas said that first evening, standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat still on, as though he might need to leave at any moment. "We can go tomorrow, if you're still here." "I will be here," she said. He looked at her for a long time. Whatever he saw seemed to puzzle him. "Why?" he said. It was the most he had spoken since the livery. "Why would a woman like you answer an advertisement like mine?" Eleanor set her carpetbag on the table and opened it. Inside, folded on top, was a child's cotton dress, white with blue flowers, sized for a girl of about 3. She did not explain it. She simply let him see it, and then she closed the bag. Silas looked at the bag. He looked at her. He put his hat back on and walked out into the dark. And for a long time, Eleanor stood alone in a kitchen she did not know, listening to 7 boys whispering behind a door that was not quite shut, and she thought, "This will do. This noise, this chaos, this will do." That was Tuesday. By Wednesday, the war had begun. The rooster was the first assault. It appeared in her room at 3:30 in the morning, courtesy of the middle boys, Amos and Fletcher, aged 8 and 10, who had apparently spent a full hour coaxing the bird up the stairs with a trail of corn. Eleanor woke to a shriek that was not her own, found the rooster on her washstand, and carried it downstairs by its feet with a calm that unnerved every boy who was watching from the landing. The salt came next. Someone, she suspected Thatcher, replaced the sugar in the kitchen jar, and her first batch of biscuits tasted like the Dead Sea. She ate one without flinching, looked Thatcher in the eye, and said, "A little heavy on the seasoning, but I've had worse in Baltimore." The boys exchanged glances. This was not the reaction they had planned for. Her shoes vanished on the second night. She found them eventually, buried in the chicken yard, and wore them mud-caked to breakfast without comment. A dead mouse appeared in her water pitcher. A tripwire of twine stretched across the hallway. Her hairbrush disappeared and resurfaced in the barn, bristles full of hay. Through all of it, Eleanor did not raise her voice, did not cry, did not threaten. She simply continued. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees until it showed wood grain no one had seen in 2 years. She mended a pile of shirts that had been sitting in a basket so long the bottom ones had mildewed. She found the garden, overrun, half dead, and began pulling weeds with the grim patience of a woman who understood that some things only yield to repetition. And she watched the boys. She learned them. Thatcher was the general, proud and furious and terrified of being replaced. Amos was the shadow, quiet, watchful, the one who noticed everything. Fletcher was the loudest, the performer, the one who needed an audience. The twins, Cass and Henry, aged 6, operated as a single creature with 4 legs and an unlimited appetite for destruction. Lawrence, 11, was the reader, the one who hid books under his mattress like contraband. And the youngest, Bowie, 5 years old, carried a tin whistle in his pocket everywhere he went. He did not play it. He just held it, the way a man holds a locket with a picture inside. It had been his mother's. Eleanor learned this not from Silas, who said nothing about his dead wife, but from Lawrence, who told her in a whisper one afternoon while she was hanging sheets. She used to play it after supper, Lawrence said, every night. When she stopped playing, that's when everything went quiet. Eleanor nodded. She understood quiet. She had lived inside it for 2 years, since the scarlet fever took her daughter, Rosalie, in the space of 6 days. She had sat in that Philadelphia house with its 4 rooms and listened to the silence accumulate like snow, and when she could no longer breathe under the weight of it, she had opened a newspaper and found Silas Greer's advertisement and thought, 7 children. 7. That is enough noise to drown anything. She had not told Silas this. She had not told anyone. The child's dress in her carpet bag was the only evidence she carried, and she kept it folded and hidden, a relic of a life she could not return to and could not quite release. The turning came on the 5th night, and it came through the stomach, as most truths in a frontier household eventually do. Eleanor had found in the back of the root cellar a piece of beef that Silas had been saving for no occasion in particular, perhaps because every occasion felt too ordinary to deserve it. She rubbed it with salt and pepper and dried sage from the garden, and she roasted it low and slow in the iron stove for 5 hours while the smell crept through the house like a rumor. By supper time, even Thatcher could not pretend he did not care. The boys drifted into the kitchen one by one, pulled by their noses, and when Eleanor set the roast on the table, surrounded by roasted potatoes and carrots from the garden and biscuits that were, this time, made with actual sugar, the room went still. They had not eaten like this since the funeral. Eleanor knew it without being told. She could see it in the way Cass reached for a piece of bread with both hands, in the way Henry's eyes went wide, in the way Thatcher looked at the food and then looked away as though it had personally offended him. Grief does that. It turns even kindness into an accusation. "Sit," Eleanor said. "All of you. Eat." They ate. Even Thatcher ate. Silas sat at the head of the table with his plate in front of him and his hands in his lap, and for a long moment he just watched his sons eating, and something crossed his face that Eleanor could not name, something between pain and gratitude, a kind of bewildered sorrow at seeing his children fed properly by hands that were not the ones he had chosen. After supper, Bowie climbed into Eleanor's lap. He did not ask. He simply did it, the way a cat finds the warmest spot in a room without apology. He curled against her and fell asleep with his head against her collarbone and the tin whistle clutched in his small fist. And Eleanor sat very still in the lamplight, holding a child who was not hers, and something inside her that had been locked for 2 years opened like a door left on the latch, swinging wide in a wind she had not expected. Across the table, Silas watched. He did not speak, but he did not look away either, and that was new. Later, after she had carried Bowie to bed and tucked the whistle under his pillow, Eleanor stood on the porch in the dark and listened to the coyotes and the wind and the creak of the house settling around its 7 sleeping boys, and she whispered it to no one. "This house is full again." She did not know that the peace had an expiration. His name was George Halloran, and he arrived on a Friday in a hired carriage with a lawyer named Pruitt and a leather case full of papers that smelled like ambition. He was Margaret Greer's brother, the dead wife's brother, and he had come from Chicago with the polished confidence of a man who believed that money solved problems faster than mercy. He was handsome in the way of city men, clean-shaven and well-pressed, with fingernails that had never seen dirt beneath them and shoes that reflected the sky. But Eleanor noticed his eyes. They moved too quickly, cataloging the ranch the way an auctioneer scans a room, calculating value, estimating return. "Silas," George said, stepping down from the carriage with a smile that arrived before the rest of his face had decided on an expression. "You look thin." "George," Silas said the name like a stone he was placing on a grave. "I've come about the boys." The conversation that followed happened on the porch while Eleanor listened from the kitchen window, her hands in dishwater, her heart climbing into her throat. George Halloran had a proposition. He had consulted his lawyer. He had concerns. Silas was, in George's estimation, an unfit father. Overwhelmed, impoverished, isolated, unable to provide proper education or medical care for 7 growing boys. George was prepared to petition the territorial court for custody. He would raise the boys in Chicago. They would have schools, doctors, clothing that was not patched at the elbows. And the ranch? Well, the ranch was part of Margaret's inheritance, was it not? Perhaps it was better managed by someone with capital. There it was. Not concern, appetite. Eleanor's hands went still in the water. She had heard that tone before, in courtrooms in Philadelphia, in the offices of men who used children as currency to move property from one column to another. She knew what George Halloran was, and she knew it the way you know a rattlesnake by its sound before you see its body. The recognition was in the bones. Silas said almost nothing. He stood on his own porch with his hat in his hands and let George talk. And when George was finished, Silas said, "They're my boys." "They're Margaret's boys too," George said. "And Margaret is gone, and from what I can see, this place is going with her." He was not wrong about the ranch. The drought had started 3 weeks earlier, a slow strangulation that turned the creek to a trickle and the pasture to paper. The cattle were losing weight. The well was dropping. Every morning Silas walked out and looked at the sky, and the sky looked back at him with nothing to offer but heat. The land was drying out, and so was his hope, and George Halloran had chosen his moment the way a wolf chooses the weakest animal at the edge of the herd. "You have until the October session," Pruitt the lawyer said, handing Silas a sheaf of papers. The judge will hear the petition then. I suggest you find counsel." They left in their carriage, trailing dust that hung in the air long after they were gone, and Eleanor came out of the kitchen and stood beside Silas, and neither of them spoke for a while. "He wants the land," Eleanor said finally. "He wants what Margaret had," Silas said. "He always did." "Can he take the boys?" Silas looked at her, and for the first time she saw fear in him, real fear, not the wary caution of a man who has been hurt, but the raw terror of a man who is about to lose the only thing that matters. "I don't know," he said. That night, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table after the boys were in bed and wrote a letter to a lawyer she had known in Philadelphia, a man named Aldrich, who owed her a favor from a time she did not like to think about. She sealed it and gave it to Silas in the morning. "What's this?" he said. "A chance," she said. The drought tightened. The creek dried to a dark stain in the rocks. Silas and Thatcher spent entire days hauling water from the deeper well on the north pasture, and even that was beginning to taste of iron and desperation. 2 calves died in 1 week. The garden Eleanor had coaxed back to life went brown at the edges and then brown all the way through, and she stood among the dead plants one evening and felt the old silence trying to creep back in, the silence of things ending, the silence of rooms where no one lives. But the house was not silent. That was the difference. The house was full of boys fighting over boots and arguing about whose turn it was to haul firewood, and slamming doors and dropping tin plates and existing, loudly, relentlessly, the way only children can exist. And Eleanor held on to that noise the way a drowning woman holds on to a rope. She told Silas about Rosalie on a night when the heat would not let either of them sleep. They sat on the porch in the dark, and she told him, not everything, but enough. The fever, the 6 days. The dress she kept folded in her bag because she could not bring herself to give it away and could not bear to look at it. "I did not come here because I had nowhere else to go," she said. "I came because I could not stand one more morning of waking up in a house where no one needed me. I came for the noise." Silas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Margaret used to say this house was so loud she couldn't hear herself pray." "I would give anything for that problem," Eleanor said. He looked at her in the dark, and she could not see his face, but she could feel something shifting between them, a wall going from stone to sand. "This house is full again," he said, and it was the first time he had used her words, and she understood that he had been listening all along. George Halloran did not wait for October. He came back in September with Pruitt and a second lawyer and a doctor from Cheyenne who had been paid to write a report about the living conditions at the Greer Ranch. The report was damning. It described the drought, the dead cattle, the patched clothing, the lack of a schoolhouse within riding distance, and it concluded that the children were in danger of malnourishment and neglect. It did not mention that every one of those boys was loved. Reports rarely do. George filed his petition early. The hearing was set for the 3rd week of September in the courthouse in Rawlins, a building made of pine boards and determination that served as courtroom, meeting hall, and occasional dance floor depending on the day. Judge Orrin Whitfield presiding, a man known for his fairness and his impatience in roughly equal measure. Eleanor prepared. She scrubbed every boy until they shone. She mended every shirt, polished every boot, cut 7 heads of hair with kitchen scissors and a comb and a patience that bordered on heroic. She wrote to Aldrich again and received his reply. He could not come himself, but he sent a letter of recommendation and the name of a territorial lawyer in Rawlins, a woman named Clara Dunn, who had argued 3 custody cases and won them all. A woman lawyer. Silas looked at Eleanor when she told him. "Trust me," she said. Clara Dunn was small and sharp and dressed like a schoolteacher, and she arrived in Ellison Flats 2 days before the hearing with a satchel full of case law and a manner that suggested she had been underestimated by better men than George Halloran and had enjoyed every minute of their surprise. "Tell me about the children," Clara said, sitting at Eleanor's kitchen table with a cup of coffee that Eleanor had made from the last of their store. "They are wild," Eleanor said. "They are rude. They hid my shoes and salted my bread and put a rooster in my bedroom." Clara raised an eyebrow. "They are the best thing that has happened to me in 2 years," Eleanor said. The courtroom in Rawlins was hot and crowded and smelled like pine sap and tobacco. George Halloran sat on one side with his two lawyers and his pressed suit and his doctor's report, and Silas sat on the other side with Clara Dunn and Eleanor and 7 boys arranged on a bench in descending order of height, like a staircase made of defiance. George spoke first, through Pruitt. The argument was clean and practiced. Silas Greer was a man broken by grief, unable to provide, living on a ranch that was failing, with no wife. Or rather, with a wife of only weeks, a stranger, a mail-order arrangement, hardly a stable maternal presence. The boys deserved better. George could provide better. He had the means, the education, the resources. Pruitt produced the doctor's report. He produced financial statements. He produced a letter from a school in Chicago that had already reserved 7 places. It was thorough and persuasive, and utterly without warmth, and Eleanor sat listening to it with her hands folded in her lap and her knuckles white. Clara Dunn stood. She was a full head shorter than Pruitt, and she did not seem to notice or care. "Your Honor," she said, "Mr. Halloran has presented an impressive collection of paper. I would like to present something less tidy but considerably more relevant. I would like the court to hear from the children." George's face went tight. Pruitt objected. Judge Whitfield overruled him with a wave of his hand that suggested he had been hoping someone would say something interesting. Thatcher went first. 13 years old, hands shaking, jaw set in that line he had inherited from his mother. "My pa works harder than any man in this territory," Thatcher said. "The drought isn't his fault. The ranch isn't failing. It's fighting, same as us. And Mrs. Greer—" He stopped. He looked at Eleanor. "She's not our mother. Our mother is dead. But she came here and she stayed, and nobody stays. Everyone said she'd run. She didn't run." Amos spoke next, quiet Amos, who never said much to anyone. "She eats the bad biscuits," he said. The courtroom rippled with something that was not quite laughter. Lawrence spoke about the books Eleanor had found for him, a crate of them bought with her own money from a peddler passing through. Fletcher spoke about the garden she had planted and the way she had taught him to tell a weed from a seedling. The twins said nothing intelligible but refused to let go of Eleanor's skirt, which said enough. And then Bowie stood, 5 years old, holding the tin whistle in both hands. He looked at George Halloran, whom he had met exactly twice in his life, and he looked at Eleanor, who had carried him to bed every night for 2 months, and he said, in a voice so clear it reached the back wall of that pine-board courtroom, "She's our ma now." The room went still, not quiet, still. The kind of stillness that happens when something true has been said and everyone in the room knows it, and no amount of paper or money can make it untrue. Silas stood. He had not planned to speak. Clara had told him he did not have to. But he stood anyway, this man who had not put a full sentence together in over a year, and he gripped the back of the bench in front of him, and he said, "My wife died, and I let the world go dark. I did. I stopped talking. I stopped seeing what my boys needed. I stopped being the father Margaret married, and I would have kept on stopping until everything was gone. But this woman walked into my house, and she did not leave. She did not leave when my sons tried to drive her out. She did not leave when the well went dry and the cattle started dying. She did not leave when this man showed up with his lawyers and his threats. She stayed. And I am asking this court to let me keep what she built, because she built it out of nothing, out of dust and stubbornness and a grief I did not even know she was carrying, and that is more than George Halloran has ever built in his life." The courtroom was silent. Judge Whitfield looked at George Halloran. He looked at the doctor's report on the desk in front of him. He looked at the 7 boys on the bench and at the woman sitting among them with a 5-year-old's hand in hers. "Mr. Halloran," the judge said, "I have read your petition carefully. I note that your concern for these children appears to have materialized at roughly the same time as your interest in the property deed. I am not in the habit of separating children from a father who loves them and a household that has proven its resilience under extraordinary circumstances." Petition denied. George Halloran left Rawlins that afternoon. He did not say goodbye to the boys. He did not look back. And Pruitt folded his papers into his leather case and followed his client into the hired carriage, and the dust closed behind them like a curtain at the end of a bad play. On the ride home, Bowie fell asleep in Eleanor's lap again, and the tin whistle pressed its small, cold shape against her arm, and she held him and watched the land go by. The same dry, stubborn, sun-beaten land that had tried to break them, and she thought, "We are still here." The rain came in October, not gently, but all at once, the way grace sometimes arrives, too late to save what was already lost, but in time to save everything else. The creek ran brown with mud and then ran clear, and the pasture greened at the edges, and Silas stood in the yard with his face turned up and his hat in his hand, and let the water run down him like a baptism he had been refusing for 14 months. Eleanor found him there. She stood beside him in the rain, and neither of them moved. And after a while, Silas took her hand and held it, and it was the first time he had touched her since the day she arrived, and his hand was rough and warm and shaking slightly, and neither of them spoke, because there are moments when words are the wrong currency. That evening, after the boys were asleep, Silas sat across from Eleanor at the kitchen table and said, "I would like to marry you." "We are married," she said. "I mean properly," he said. "Not because of an advertisement, not because of a transaction, because I want to." She looked at him. He looked at her. The lamp flickered between them. "I would like that," she said. They were married again on a Sunday in November, in the parlor of the ranch house, by the same preacher who had performed the first ceremony. But this time, Eleanor wore a dress she had sewn herself from blue cotton, and the boys stood in a row behind them, and Bowie held the tin whistle above his head like a torch, and when the preacher said the words, Silas answered in a voice that did not hesitate and did not break. The adoption papers were filed in December, 7 signatures, 7 names, written in 7 different versions of a child's handwriting, some of them barely legible, all of them permanent. Eleanor Greer, née Fry, mother. Thatcher, who was 13 and had sworn on the first day that she would not last, handed her the pen. "You stayed," he said, and then, because he was 13 and could not say more without risking everything he had built around his heart, that's all. It was enough. 3 years passed. The ranch recovered. The drought became a story they told, a scar on the landscape that faded but did not disappear. Silas talked now. Not a lot, never a lot, but enough. He laughed sometimes, a sound so unfamiliar that the first time the boys heard it, Cass asked if he was choking. The garden grew. The cattle multiplied. Lawrence went away to a school in Laramie and wrote letters home every week in handwriting that got smaller and more elegant as the months went by. Thatcher grew into a man so quietly that no one noticed until he was suddenly taller than his father and shaving with a straight razor and reading cattle prices in the newspaper with a frown that belonged to someone twice his age. And Eleanor lived inside the noise. She lived inside the slamming doors and the arguments and the boots on the stairs and the smell of bread baking and the sound of boys existing, and she never once wished for silence, not even on the hard days, not even on the days when the twins broke a window, or Amos disappeared for 6 hours and was found reading in the hayloft, or Fletcher brought a snake into the kitchen for the 3rd time in a month. On a morning in spring, when the wildflowers had come up along the creek and the meadowlarks were singing in the fence posts, Eleanor sat on the porch with a bundle in her arms. A girl, 8 days old, dark hair and dark eyes, and a grip that could stop a heartbeat. They named her Margaret, after the woman whose absence had made room for Eleanor's presence, and that felt right, and that felt necessary, and no one in the family questioned it. Bowie, now 8, came and sat beside Eleanor on the porch. He had grown into a serious boy with his father's quiet and his mother's, his first mother's, gentle stubbornness. He reached into his pocket and took out the tin whistle. He looked at it for a long time. Then he placed it in the baby's blanket next to her curled fist, and he said, "She can have it now." Eleanor looked at him. She looked at the whistle. She looked out at the land, green and breathing and alive under a sky so wide it made promises it might actually keep. "This house is full again," she said. And it was not a wish this time, and it was not a prayer. It was simply the truth, spoken aloud, in a place where truth had learned to live. The wind came across the Wyoming grass, and it did not take anything. It just moved through, the way music moves through a room, and the meadowlarks sang, and the baby slept, and somewhere inside the house, a boy dropped a tin plate, and another boy laughed, and the sound carried out across the porch and into the valley and became part of everything that was there. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end, for staying with Eleanor and Silas and every one of those 7 boys. I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. Leave me a comment, tell me your city, tell me what the sky looks like where you are. And if this story made your chest tight in the good way, hit subscribe so you are here when the next one comes. I will be waiting for you. Until then, safe travels wherever the road takes you.